From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Islamist group Hamas shakes Israel and the world with an invasion of the Jewish state from Gaza over the weekend that kills more than 800 at last count. The Islamists massacred something like 260 young people at a music festival in the Negev desert and took an unknown number of hostages, including women, children, and some foreigners. At least 9 Americans have been identified as killed so far, according to U.S. officials, and others are missing. Israel has declared war for the first time in 50 years since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, another surprise attack. And Israel is mobilizing for what its defense officials say will be a ground assault on Gaza. What does all of this return to war in the Middle East mean for Israel and for American interests in an increasingly disordered world? We will talk about that today. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal, and I'm here with my esteemed colleagues, Bill McGurn and Joe Sternberg. Welcome. Let's start with the shock of the surprise attack by Hamas and some of the horrific scenes. The massacre at the Tribe of Nova Music Festival echoes of some of the worst massacres of the innocent we've seen. Piles of bodies in one place, people shot at point-blank range as they tried to flee to their cars. It seemed that they were murdered simply because they were there and because Hamas deemed them to be Israelis and Jews, although more than a few foreigners were also caught up in the massacre. It's a horrific scene. Bill, I wonder what you think the impact of this psychologically is going to be, not just on Israel, but on the debates about the Middle East in the United States.
Well, we should get rid of any illusions. In the Israeli context, I think there are about 300 killed.
I think 800, Bill. I think it's 800.
Yeah, 800. It's larger than 9/11 for them. And that they were taken by surprise is not a good sign. I think we're just going to have to reevaluate everything. I mean, the attack, we now learn that Iran approved the attack before it happened, probably supplied a lot of the weapons. We just gave Iran several $billion for hostages. And I think it's going to mean a lot dropping of illusion. Netanyahu has already said, in America, you just hear this and you think it's another skirmish between Israel and Hamas, but it's very different this time. They came inside Israel deeper than they have been. They took hostages, and he's warned that it's going to be a long war. And I worry that when Israel does fight back, a lot of the sympathy and support will disappear as they say they're hurting the Palestinian populations in impacted areas when Israel does counterattack. So they're going to need all the moral support and military support that they can get.
It's a huge shock to the body politic in Israel, which had obviously, because of its technological and military prowess, had, I think, developed a certain confidence, if not complacency, Joe, about their ability to deter any attacks and really stop some attacks. And it's clear from even the initial reporting that's coming out of Israel that they had let their guard down to some extent with Hamas, thinking that Islamic Jihad was the bigger threat. But it's clear that Hamas was plotting this all along. And I think the one consequence of this, and this is in the regional implications, is that the status quo before this invasion for Gaza is not going to be tenable. The Israelis had given up control over Gaza in 2005, thinking there had been settlements. And in fact, I visited Gaza and saw some of those Jewish settlements in the early 1990s. And nonetheless, Ariel Sharon the former prime minister, decided to pull out of Gaza, turn it over to the Palestinians. But in 2007, Hamas took over and has since used it as a staging ground for attacks on Israel, usually rocket attacks, nothing this dramatic or horrible. But I think that Israel's not going to be able to let that happen in one way or another after their assault, which will probably be a ground assault into Gaza, that they will have to find some other way of making sure this never happens again. Maybe it's a buffer area. Maybe it's a permanent troop deployment. I'm not sure.
Yes, I mean, I think continuing Bill's theme of shattering illusions here, I think that one of the big illusions that should be shattered, perhaps not so much in Israel because the Israelis will already have known this, but in much of the rest of the world, concerns Hamas itself. And this is a key issue for the future status of Gaza. I think the conceit in much of the world had been that, there was sort of a Palestinian government of some sort that was capable of managing this area. What we're discovering is that that de facto government is, in fact, still a terrorist organization. I mean, one of the things that is so appalling about the war that broke out over the weekend is that it's really difficult to distinguish between what Hamas was doing here and terrorism. I mean, to describe it as a war, even akin to something like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is to downplay the element of sheer terrorism that is involved in what has happened here, the attacks on the civilian populations, the abductions, the allegations of rape against the civilian population. I mean, this is not a war in any sort of normal sense. And I think that that is going to have to color people's understanding of what is a viable outcome in Gaza after the fighting has stopped, because I think that to leave an obviously terrorist organization such as Hamas, to allow them to continue to be in control of territory in the way that they have been, is not going to be sustainable. I mean, it's going to be a threat to Israel, and it's going to destabilize the rest of the region.
Joe, I think I disagree with you on definitional terms there. I think it is a war. And I think I would worry that defining it as simply terrorism, I agree with you, Hamas is a terrorist organization, but it is, if the reports of the Iranian instigation and assent and supply are true, and we now have a pretty compelling report from the Wall Street Journal that Iran did, in fact, not only sign off on this, but essentially agreed on the timing of it. This is based on the journal report sources from Hamas and Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed militia in Lebanon, that if these reports are true, then this is a war, because it's a war that Iran and its allies are fighting against Israel. And I worry that just defining it as terrorism per se almost diminishes it, because I think this is about an existential peril for Israel. This is something that Iran wants. I mean, it's not an invasion, a la the Yom Kippur Egyptian invasion of 1973. It's not an attempt to overrun Israeli territory by a formal state actor, but it was an invasion of southern Israel by a state-supported actor, Hamas. And the danger for the Israelis here is that when I think they go into Gaza, there could be a second front that opens from Hezbollah in the north in Lebanon, also backed with their hundreds of thousands of missiles.
I agree. I mean, I don't think there's that much difference. Terrorism is basically organized activity by a group of war criminals. And I think Israel knows that it has to confront them on all fronts, including Iran, its enemies. And as usual, the disadvantage for all its might that Israel has is that every war is potentially an existential threat to Israel. So I think it's going to be a multi-front and long-term engagement. But, for us, I think part of the problem is the world views these things in discrete terms. There's China and Taiwan, Ukraine and Russia, Israel and the Middle East, North Korea and the rest of Asia. And the chaos all feeds on one another. When the bad guys look at the world and they see our withdrawal from Afghanistan, that we support Ukraine but don't give them enough to prevail, that we're not really boosting our military in the way it deserves, they have to wonder, is this a good time? And every attack made by one of these bad actors increases the likelihood that another will exploit the chaos to go in and perform their aggression.
Yeah, I very much agree with that, and I want to elaborate on that a little bit later. But Joe, I want to give you a chance to respond to me on on my point about the threat.
Oh, I don't disagree with you at all about that. I guess the way I would crystallize what I was trying to say here is that what we're seeing is terrorism as a form of warfare. So I think that, certainly understanding that this is not a war in the sense that people typically think of it in terms of you have a state on each side of it and you can assume a certain amount of rationality on the part of the actors. This is a terror organization with the support of another malign state actor in the region is using terrorism as a tool of war. And I think that the kind of understanding that this is the sort of enemy that Israel is dealing with, I think is going to have to color people's understanding of what is a reasonable expectation, because sort of if anyone's hope is that you can go back to some sort of stable arrangement here if you just bottle Hamas back up inside Gaza, I think it's becoming pretty clear that that is not true. And I think we need to understand the kind of war that Israel is locked in now and who their opponents are and what Hamas has told us about what they are prepared to do to achieve their aims over the weekend.